Thank you, Catherine. Well, good morning, and I'd just like to begin by thanking Catherine and everyone involved here at the Oxford Internet Institute for the invitation to come and talk here this morning. I should just say before I get going that I am not actually going to talk about any specific crowdsourcing projects this morning at all. So this is a question-asking presentation, not an answering presentation in any way, shape or form. A lot of the questions that I will be hoping to ask actually came from an AHRC study that I conducted with my colleague Mark Hedges, who may or may not be coming today, at the Centre for E-Research at King's College London for the AHRC's Connected Communities programme last year. And this was a research review that sought to have a look in the wild at uses of crowdsourcing in the academic humanities and to see what sort of models of crowdsourcing are being adopted, how they're being used, and how, if at all, should we be modifying them? How should we be rethinking these models for humanities research questions? Now, this, as I say, this was a fairly wide-ranging review. We deliberately left the parameters quite broad, or extremely broad, possibly too broad in a sense. But in the course of that review, I ended up talking to an awful lot of people, a number of whom I can see in this room. So hello, everyone, and thanks again for your help with the review. And what we sought to do was come up with a kind of typology for humanities crowdsourcing that would seek to frame it as an epistemic academic or a set of academic methodologies rather perhaps than as the business model that it has come to be known as. So possibly well, not to our surprise, I guess, but in the literature we actually turned up a number of pre-existing definitions of crowdsourcing. And as far as we could tell, the first instance of the term, the first usage of the term, came in an article in Wired magazine in 2006 by Jeff Howe, who said that, as it says there, it doesn't matter where the labourers are, might be down the block, might be in Indonesia, as long as they're connected to the network. Labour isn't always free, costs a lot less than paying traditional employees. It's not outsourcing, it's crowdsourcing. So at the outset here, Howe is positioning crowdsourcing as a, in parallel to the back then sort of emerging concept of outsourcing. So rather than moving tasks of business to cheaper labour markets elsewhere in the world, you know, it is about moving tasks to volunteer communities. Now, the kind of one sentence definition that myself and Mark came up with, we tried to broaden this slightly when we talk of the process of leveraging public participation in or contributions to projects and activities. So it is, you know, in this we are explicitly trying to include notions of public engagement, of you know, the kind of conversations that researchers, particularly in the kind of historical, archaeological museum sectors, I should say I'm an archaeologist myself by background, attempt to engage members of the public with. I think we decided at a fairly early stage, and I think we followed a number of other people who have considered crowdsourcing in the humanities at least, when we came up with this, is that we decided it was probably not so much the wisdom of crowds thesis put forward by James Ricci in his 2004 book, The Wisdom of Crowds, Why the Many Are Smarter Than the Few. For the simple reason that the wisdom of crowds thesis is about collective decision making. It's not so much about the generation of knowledge or the creation of understanding. It is a thesis that a crowd of I would say inexperienced or people lacking professional qualifications are just as good at making decisions as people who are supposedly expert in making those decisions. So I think that's quite an important distinction that we came up with. Now, a rather sort of telling definition is Brabham's 2008 sort of statement, where he describes crowdsourcing as a hybrid model that blends the transparent and democratizing elements of open source. Open source is a subject of a different lecture, so I'm not going to go into that here, into a feasible model for doing profitable business, all facilitated through the web. So again, there is this concept of connectivity, of interconnectedness, of being connected to the web, but ultimately it is about doing profitable business. And all of these early definitions of crowdsourcing from the mid-noughties tend to talk about crowdsourcing as a business model, along with outsourcing. So, in more recent times, particularly in the so-called GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, museums and archives, I just love that acronym, talk about, again, more about public engagement, about inviting participation, and this quote from Owens, I think, sort of sums this up quite nicely. So, we are certainly not alone in this desire we had to kind of rethink crowdsourcing as a means not just of doing for-profit business, or not just a means of engaging people in profit-making activities, but engaging people in the narratives around humanities and humanities research questions. And as Owen says there are long-standing traditions, especially in the GLAM sectors, of volunteerism and involvement of citizens in the creation and continued development of public goods. So, what do we mean by fundamentals? Any discussion of fundamentals in the digital humanities has to include... Actually, I should maybe try and... somebody could have told me that this wasn't actually... Yeah, anyway, that's much better. I've just got back from holiday, I'm not awake yet. Any discussion of fundamentals, certainly where the digital humanities is concerned, has to, by law, include this methodological commons map of Harold Short and Willard McCarty, produced in 2004, which seeks to position digital methodologies as an epistemic means of creating knowledge. So at the top, at the sort of the bottom there, you have the kind of traditional subject areas, the kind of the disciplines. At the top there, you have the kind of the subjects of study, and then between them and linking them, you have these new emergent and dynamic ways of doing things with that content in those areas, the so-called methodological commons. So, ways of analysing narrative text, ways of analysing numbers, ways of analysing music or images or kind of tabular information and so forth. So the question that Mark and I set out when we did our research review of crowdsourcing is, can we do something similar for crowdsourcing in the humanities? Is there a core set of methodologies, of ways of doing things that people are already using? Bearing in mind we were not funded to undertake research ourselves, only to look at other people's research. Are there discernible patterns in the way that people are engaging, that scholars are engaging wider communities to approach their content? So, oops. Now, as I said, we are not necessarily the first people to ask these questions. So, this definition here from 2012 actually took quite a processual approach to the field of crowdsourcing. This was an analysis of crowdsourcing particularly in the cultural heritage sector, I think it was. And as you say, it sort of starts with the crowd, it looks at the task at hand, it also looks at what people get for being involved. What is this quid pro quo for somebody giving up their time and their energy and their effort to actually get involved and contribute to a project. The motivations of the initiator of the crowdsourcing activity, what they want out of it. So obviously there are two sets of motivations in play there. What is obtained by them in the crowdsourcing process, the type of process itself, how the call to participate is disseminated, and I think sort of social media is changing that as we speak, and the medium in which the activity is conducted. So again, this kind of implies this was a review of I think over 150 academic papers in the areas of cultural crowdsourcing and citizen science. So it took this kind of sequential and processual approach to how crowdsourcing actually works. Now, Wiggins and Crowston, who focused more explicitly on citizen science, and we're going to, I think, hear later more about citizen science, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about that. This sought to be more categorical about the kinds of activities that crowdsourcing is available for. So there is the idea of action, there is the idea of conservation, of investigation, of virtual forms of crowdsourcing, and education. So rather than focusing on the processes, this focuses on the subjects and the sort of the usefulness, if you will, of citizen science. But I think sort of going back in time here, sort of deliberately in a way, Bonney et al.'s report for the Public Science Foundation in the US boiled it down to 3 kinds of projects that were emerging in 2009 at that time in citizen science, particularly in citizen science projects for education. So these are contributory projects which are set up by a central research team which the public are then invited to contribute to, and I think projects like Galaxy Zoo in the UK would fall into that sort of category. Collaborative projects which essentially are initiated by a core research team, but which then have members of the public coming in and helping to design the direction and to contribute questions that the project might ask. And co-created projects, which are completely grassroots. They come from the community upwards. So I think I think all 3 of these definitions, or all 3 of these sort of conceptions of fundamentals of crowdsourcing are quite useful for thinking about the sorts of activities in sort of history, geography, and so forth that we came across in our report. But I think particularly this kind of tripartite definition of Bonney et al., this explicitly allows us to move beyond the idea of, crowdsourcing being purely a contributory one-way exercise. It also allows the notion of, as I say, co-creation, of involving the crowd, as it were, in defining research questions, as well as simply creating or simply sort of processing content or creating knowledge. So, having looked at 100 or so projects, research papers and blogs and various other things ourselves, we sought to come up with our own typology for humanities crowdsourcing. So we did this in 4 different ways. There was a literature review. We conducted a series of interviews with contributors of humanities crowdsourcing projects. We held 2 workshops at King's College London in May and October of last year, and we held an online survey for crowdsourcing contributors. And sort of with, as I mentioned at the beginning, the help of numerous people in this room, you know who you are, we kind of boiled it all down, and we sought to come up with our own sort of typology of how humanities crowdsourcing fundamentals can be conceived of. Now, this typology, unlike the others, is in a sense much more workflow-based, and it comes down into 4 facets. The first of which is what we call assets. What is humanities crowdsourcing used for? What sort of assets are humanists using, or what sort of content are humanities people using in relation to crowdsourcing? The first is text. I would say this is in rough order of what should I say, not significance, of predominance. I would say editing, correcting, improving in some way text or transcribing text is by far the most common deployment of crowdsourcing, and I think we will be hearing from the Bentham project later. Tom's here somewhere, yes. Then sort of image crowdsourcing. Again, this is where the definitions of what we mean by sort of processes and what we mean by crowdsourcing itself is quite interesting. I mean, the Flickr Commons project, for example, is a hugely significant Library of Congress project which uses crowdsourcing to categorize and tag the institutional image collections. And again, we'll be hearing from the Your Paintings project shortly, which is another of the projects that we spoke to. Geospatial kind of georeferencing is another area, and hello Kimberly at the back there. Institutions like the British Library using crowdsourcing to improve access to map collections by creating geospatial metadata on historic maps, numerical statistical information, sound and video. And we kind of ummed and ahed and had quite a lot of internal debates before we included ephemera and intangible cultural heritage. But essentially, I think this is actually one of the most important and most interesting assets that is available for crowdsourcing, for the collection of oral histories, for the collection of sort of personal experience. And if you go back to Bonnie et al.'s sort of co-curated projects, we observed a lot of grassroots activity in the growing of crowdsourcing projects within communities to develop exactly this sort of thing. So our second facet in our four-facet typology was the kind of tasks involved. And so we identified these kind of 6 different tasks which do not correspond in any one accurate way to the assets, but I mean, you have very kind of mechanical tasks, things which are sort of very unitary, very straightforward. For example, transcribing numerical information from birth certificate collections into a web form to make it machine readable. Configurational, which is about identifying patterns in data or patterns in information. Editorial tasks, which is, again, generally related to the textual assets. Synthetic tasks, where things are being sort of brought together and synthesized. Investigation, the Guardian's use of crowdsourcing to investigate the MP's expenses disc was a rather nice example of that, where people go and ferret out information in great or interesting information in great unordered masses of data. And then creative tasks, And again, there is a sort of continuum, or rather a spectrum, whereby we notice, well, we would infer that a lot more people, rather larger numbers of people, would be inclined to do one sort of task. Much smaller numbers would be inclined to do others, like the creative or the investigative, for example. And projects which experience massive volumes of contributions, like the Family Indexing Project, which sought to make machine readable these vast collections of birth certificates and official documentation of that sort. There are over 100,000 people contributing to those, far fewer people contributing to community-based creative crowdsourcing projects. Our third facet, what does it produce? What is the outcome? Well, there's a kind of list there. This is, I should say, not in order of in any sort of significance that we could identify, because we could not identify, or it was really not our place to identify, one more an outcome that was more significant than another. But all of these represent sort of assets that have been transformed in some way by the crowdsourcing process. And indeed, processes is our final and, I think, most significant kind of, most significant facet of our typology. These are what we would characterize as the sort of the fundamentals, those replicable things that we see going through the assets, the tasks that are applied to them, and the outputs. So, we sort of came up with examples for all of these. I haven't got time to go through individual examples for each one, but I'll be giving the link to the report at the end. But I just wanted to sort of say to sort of state that the methodology of coming up with these is about I say identifying the workflows that are most useful for the humanities research questions, or approaching the humanities research questions addressed by any particular project. So there we have the processes at the middle and the assets, the tasks and the outputs sort of all around them in that way. This will probably, in the future iterations of this research, start to look much more like that cloud of methodological commons that I showed at the beginning. It's inevitable, really. So, yeah, just to kind of start wrapping up. Very crudely, and there is no scientific method to this at all, I should say. I think it is useful to kind of think of that list of fundamental processes on a sort of axis of specialist knowledge experience versus the size of the crowd in numbers. So the left-hand side there, you know, you have more and more kind of specialist knowledge, special experience is needed. You know, fewer and fewer people kind of have that at this end. So you would get an activity or a process like collaborative tagging, for example, which anyone with an interest in the subject could do. You don't necessarily need specialist knowledge or experience. Versus something like cataloging, for example, which implies, you know, adding sort of context and sort of knowledge and curation to a digital collection. You know, you're going to have far fewer people, but requiring sort of more specialist knowledge and experience to kind of do that. So all of those tasks, all of those processes, rather, I think could, at particular points of their execution, be plotted onto a graph like this. But it's extremely important to note that of course, as people engage with these processes, they can acquire specialist knowledge and experience. And, you know, they can move up this graph. They can sort of become part of those much smaller crowds with much sort of different and more specialist things to contribute. And we saw numerous examples of that in the course of our review, particularly the Old Weather Project should get an honourable mention at this point, where people start out transcribing logs of historic ships in order to capture the weather observations of those ships, which then feeds into kind of understanding of climate change. But then a small number of those people go on to get very, very involved in the task, in the process, and they kind of end up editing histories of individual ships and feeling a great sense of ownership of their individual ships. So just to kind of underscore that a little bit, this is well, one of the outcomes of our survey. You know, this was, I should say, there is no way in which this is statistically significant, of course. This was pitched at sort of super contributors in a way. So we got a small number of very qualitative responses back, but far and away the main motivation driving people to these projects we found was subject interest. You know, they share the kind of the passions and the motivations of the academics sort of starting off the project. So that, I think, is quite sort of interesting in itself. Oops, sorry. And then we kind of started out with this kind of very broad classification of the kind of tasks that people were doing, and our task typology sort of evolved from this. But again, you can see that transcribing was by far the most common task. But what was interesting about this question is that people frequently specified more than one kind of activity that they were doing. So people often said, you know, that as well as transcribing, they were also doing commenting. So bearing in mind that this was a small number of super contributors, I think it points to a very multivariate form of engagement that that these people have. And if we're being honest, I think if we want humanities crowdsourcing to take off as a field, as an emerging field or any other sort of field, you know, those are the sorts of communities we should not just be looking to target, but we should be looking to kind of form and nurture and connect with. So just to wrap up, fundamentals of humanities crowdsourcing are processes which are ultimately made up of assets, outputs, and tasks. And they are fundamentally methodological. They are about ways of doing things. And, you know, I've been sort of involved in digital humanities for over 10 years now, and I'm always fascinated by the discussions we have with our colleagues in the social sciences who have these wonderfully sort of clear conceptions of what their methods are, unlike humanists. I mean, you know, humanists aren't methodological at all, so that's a kind of circle that we'll have to, well, that's not true, but the methods are much more idiosyncratic and application-oriented in the humanities, and that's a square that I think has to be, a circle that has to be squared in some way. These methods are not static, they change. You know, people change as they engage with them, and as our understanding of them changes, so those processes, our definitions of those processes will surely change. And also, you know, roles in crowdsourcing projects don't change. I think every successful crowdsourcing project we spoke to in the course of doing our report found that ways of kind of engaging with the contributors and sort of allowing their roles to change and nurture and develop over time were absolutely key to forming those small sort of super contributor communities. I think I'm going to wrap up there. There is my email address and Mark's email address. The full text of the report is available at that link there. It's a temporary link. Unfortunately, the KCL, our blog server, got hacked last week, so that's down at the moment. So I put a temporary link on there if you want to go and have a look at the report. But I will be delighted to hear any questions or feedback. Thank you.
Do you have questions?
Thank you for the presentation. I found it really fascinating. One thing that intrigued me a little bit was the analogy made with outsourcing. As I'm sure you're aware, now the reverse is happening in business, in that companies are starting to insource again. What do you think the key things are that we need to do to ensure that crowdsourcing doesn't become very popular and then kind of fall slightly? People are worried the quality isn't easy to maintain.
Exactly. I mean, I think exactly the sort of argument I was trying to pitch here is that we need to move beyond that kind of business model oriented idea of crowdsourcing, which assumes that hundreds, if not thousands, of people are going to be contributing lots of sort of little bits of effort. I think the main, there's a couple of ways in which research teams in particular can engage or kind of identify these small groups of super users. Having a user forum of some sort is very important so that people can talk to each other while they're engaging with these projects. I know certainly the sense we had from the workshop we had with super contributors, we had several different projects represented there. You know, they all said that being able to talk to each other was extremely important and sort of fostered a sense of sort of community and interaction. It also gets over one of the main obstacles, I think, to the fostering of crowdsourcing in academia full stop, which is full economic costing and the institutional business models, whereby a project has an end date. After that, you know, there's nothing. That's not how crowdsourcing projects sort of work at all. I mean, you know, they develop a sort of momentum, and if there is a kind of online presence where they can interact that is independent of that, that's meant to be a help. And I know that the Bentham projects had you know, experience of that issue. So yeah, I mean, trying to foster communities and get people to talk to each other when they have important things to say to each other is probably the main thing.
Hello, Roger Bankin from Monopedia and Wikimedia. I was just picking on that point about the fact that it's with crowdsourcing, you mentioned, for instance, Wikipedia, which is one of the earliest crowdsourcing projects. That was organised by an IT company in California. That company went bust in 2003, 2000. The crowdsourcing project takes over. You shouldn't think that this is something that you are going to run. If it's a successful crowdsourcing project, that project will take over and run that subject for you, and you will end up being an advisor to that project.
We just have to convince funders that that's a good thing.
Yes. and be confident in the fact that you're going to have to lose control in order to be able to get people involved. Because if you just want them to be minions and just type what they're told to do, they're going to lose interest. You actually need to empower them and make them feel that they're actually going to be organising and running the project, and the project is so important that even if the university loses interest, we will still do it.
Plus, I could not agree more.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm from San Jose State University in California, but live here and volunteer at the Broadway. I'm just curious, because I'm a volunteer, whether there's been any studies kind of relating how to run a good volunteer program and running a good crowdsourcing campaign, because I think there's a lot of similarities there and a lot of things you could be taking from one and applying.
Sure. Well, a number of the existing projects have done that. I mean, I know Galaxy 2's done that. There's the Cornell Ornithology Project have done that sort of thing. We review some of, well, I mean, there's a full bibliography in the report, which, and we have a section summarising, well, such as those studies that we identify. There are bound to be ones that we miss. But I think the issue there is that, quite rightly and understandably, all that the people conducting those studies have been talking about their own projects and looking at volunteerism on their own projects. So they've looked at what's worked, what's been successful, what hasn't been successful in terms of their own projects. I think there hasn't been a sort of bigger systematic overview of what an academic crowdsourcing project would make it successful and what wouldn't. But if there has, we haven't come across it. But, yeah.
Did the organisers have any idea about what percentage of the time the contributors should spend face-to-face with themselves or with the organisers, or was it all done by internet?
In the first instance, it's certainly all done by internet, but I know some projects, when they really take off and they get a lot of people, or not so many people doing a lot of work, they do facilitate face-to-face meetings. I mean, I think the British Library did that with the georeferencer project. Kimberly's nodding, I think, yes. But I think generally, yes, it is. There is. We would assume that they start out as being internet enabled, and then what arrangements the projects make for face-to-face meetings and face-to-face collaborations would depend on what sort of resources they have, what they want to achieve, and that sort of thing.
Are we going to hear from the British Library later?
We are.
I believe so.
I'll seek the lady out.
We are.
What's the benefit of the face-to-face, in your opinion?
There's a few. Well, I mean, there's. It very much depends on the project. I mean, certainly in terms of the workshop that we did with contributors last year, I think it was just good to get people around a table and have a conversation. But we wanted to kind of tease out broader issues if we could. I know that some projects, I think particularly Old Weather, I don't know if there's anyone from Old Weather here, I'm taking their name not too much in vain, I hope. They found it very useful to encourage interactions over things like very difficult to read logbooks, because if they ran out of black ink on the ships and had to write in blue ink, that fades much more quickly, and there are certain methodologies that people found for being able to decipher those, which they were able to share through the user forum. So there are specific technical things like that. But also, I mean, I think from interviewing quite a few of these super contributors and having this workshop, I think a lot of them just like to have a chat about something they were mutually interested in.
I'm curious about the impacts on, I guess, the students who used to get hired to do this type of transcription work, who are now being replaced by effectively free labor.
Mm-hmm.
So the money's going into things like building infrastructures, technological infrastructures to allow crowdsourcing rather than paying a humanities researcher. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on if this is a good thing or a bad thing for that humanities side of it.
Very good question. I mean, I know the idea that crowdsourcing is exploitative is very much out there. Well, firstly, I would say that increasingly in humanities departments, students are not paid to do work on projects. You know, they are given internships or whatever. I personally do not promote unpaid positions to my students because I don't think that's the right thing to do. We actually found with a lot of the supercontributors, there's a bit of a Freudian slip there maybe, the supercontributors that we spoke to were not students. They were typically older people. A lot of them were retired. They had time on their hands for one reason or another. One of them actually said that he'd been bereaved recently and had found the diversionary sort of activity quite therapeutic in a sense. So I think there is not really a market for paid students that's being taken over by this yet, but it is something I think that institutions, and particularly their research ethics committees, do need to be very aware of, and I hope that we can highlight some awareness of that.
What about the aspect of gamification in the crowdsourcing projects?
We actually have a section on gamification in the report. It can work very well, I think, for the, I hate the phrase long tail, but you know, for the people who don't necessarily want to get a deep intellectual engagement. Some people just want to kind of sort of tinker and have a play and have a good time. And gamification works very well for that sort of constituency. For another sort of constituency, generally the people at this end of my notional graph, the people who do want to have much more of an engagement, the Crowdsourcing and Wiggins paper I cited actually suggested that it could be a turn-off because it could seem to trivialise the subject. So it does work, it can work. In fact, we had a wonderful presentation at the Crowdsourcers workshop we held by a guy from the Archaeology Data Service in York, who created a computer game to look at the usage of a castle in Sussex to decide whether it was a domestic dwelling or a military installation, and this involved getting people to sort of game their way through it and see how they respond to the space. So it has a role, but as with all other methods in crowdsourcing, it has to be very carefully nuanced and informed by the audience that it's aiming for.
We've got time for one more question, if anyone has a burning one.
Is there a risk of confusing public participation and engagement with crowdsourcing?
Yes. I think obviously the two are not the same thing. I mean, for example, we made an explicit decision to include, for example, crowdfunding in our typology. I know possibly others in this room would disagree with that, because in a sense, if you engage in that way, you know, the people being contributed, we're encouraged to sort of actually contribute something to the project. I think that's the distinction in a sense. You know, if the crowd or the individual within the crowd has something that they are giving into the project, I think participation or public awareness is simply, you know, receiving information. You know, I think it is very difficult to know where one ends and the other begins, but I think the idea of actually contributing something, whatever that is where crowdsourcing begins, for me, anyway.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Okay, thanks.